go ahead and be opening to the Gospel of Luke. That's where we'll be studying for the next few minutes as we think about the subject before us. And one of the good things, I guess, about speaking at other places sometimes is they assign you subjects. And sometimes those subjects are things that there are a lot of hard things that you can't answer, and so sometimes you just avoid them. If I'm just shooting you straight. But there are, and when they assign you that, you're kind of forced to work through it at that moment. In other assignments, you're forced to come face to face with some things that are difficult. And this was one of those for me. Dealing with just simply serving our community. What does that mean? What does that look like? You know, the older I get, and I understand I'm still very young, but the older I get, the more, what does not impress me is flash and flare and theatrics and all of this grand display. The older I get, what actually I respect the most and honor the most is a person who day in and day out just gets up and does the right thing and goes to bed and gets up and they do the right thing the next day and they go to bed and it's just that steady faithfulness. Because anybody can have a flash or a moment where they try and make some grand spectacular display. That's not really all that hard to create. But it takes a lot of faithfulness and a lot of toughness to get up every single day and just to repeat that process and just be faithful. And to constantly repeat that process. And so, when it comes to this, and I was trying to think about how to work through this in my own mind, serving your community, because in years past, when it comes to serving community, I think my mind always went to something big, and I don't know why that is. Maybe it was just my youth. You know, people think serving your community, that's got to be, you know, like... we look at places, for example, one of my friends I went to preaching school with, he is the director of an inner city ministry in Little Rock that takes care of the homeless. And, you know, I think sometimes, well, maybe that's, you know, you look at him and go, he's doing something important there. And so it's got to be something big like that. But the more I began to sit and to just think through, the more I realized that what he's doing is a tremendous thing. But if every single individual would just do the little thing, the big things actually wouldn't be necessary anymore. What makes some of those big things so necessary is because as individuals we fail to do little things across the board. And so as we think about this tonight, I want to ask just 3 questions. And don't be alarmed when we get into some of these, because they'll have several lists of things underneath the second question in particular. We're not going to look at all of them. That's not possible tonight. But I want to first answer the question, who is my neighbor? Because when you're in the community, in your community, the people that live amongst you, who is my neighbor? Okay, how do I identify who that person is? That's a biblical question. Then the second question is, what do they need? What do they need? And how do you figure that out? And then the third question is, how do I help them? Okay? So who is my neighbor? What do they need? And how do I help them? So let's begin in Luke chapter 10 with this parable of what is known as the Good Samaritan. And it's just a side note I will make. He is nowhere called good. That's a word we've attached to him, and it's a fitting word. But just know that the title itself, good, is not in the text the way that sometimes we may think it is. All right, Luke chapter 10, Jesus is in the temple, Luke 10 beginning in verse 25. And so as we look at this, as we look at parables, I follow usually the same model of outline when it comes to studying parables. I like to look at what prompts it. And so let's look at because usually there's a backdrop to it. Something has happened that's led Jesus to this moment to tell this parable. It says, "And behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' He said to him," that is, Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" Which, by the way, if you've ever been teaching, You always know there's going to be at least one person who's going to try and put you on the spot and catch you off guard. You just kind of have to learn to get over that. But the second thing, one of the things you learn is one of the best ways to handle that individual is to do what? Put it back on them. Okay? You don't have to be ugly about it. Just say, well, what do you think? Right? That's what Jesus does. What do you say? I mean, and you remember, he's a lawyer, so he's supposed to be an expert in this subject. What do you think? And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19 put together. And that was a pretty common consensus at the time, that was the summation of the law. And Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you'll live. So you can kind of feel him for a moment a little embarrassed, right? He tries to put Jesus on the spot, and Jesus just kind of turns it back around on him. And so then we get the next statement in 29, and he, desiring to justify himself, doesn't want to look bad in front of everybody, he asks this question, and who is my neighbor? So that leads Jesus to tell this parable. This parable is composed of 4 men. And what I find interesting is this. When Jesus is asked this question, who is my neighbor, he doesn't lead him to discuss an Old Testament text and say, let me remind you of what the Old Testament says right here. And now let me have a study with you on and analyze this text to explain to you who your neighbor is. He actually walks him outside of the doors of the temple into everyday life and says, let me show you who your neighbor is. We're not going to argue technicalities. We're going to go out here in everyday life, and I'm going to show you who he is. Okay? So you have the first man, which is the man who becomes wounded. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's literally going down in elevation. Jericho is north. So Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho is 800 feet below sea level. So it's, and if you look at a picture of this road, it was known as the Bloody Way because people were often captured and mugged on it, okay, or hurt and things along those lines. So, I don't know. I haven't been in Lawrence County that long. I don't know what street it is that you have in your mind. You think, I stay away from that street. I know where I grew up, you kind of know certain places that in your mind you stay away from, okay, because they're dangerous. Well, that's what's happening here. He travels down here, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Then we're introduced to the priest. It says, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now here's our religious man, right? He's the priest. He stands between God and the people and intercedes for them. And here is one of his people. We don't know if he's a Jew or a Samaritan. Most likely, it would seem to me that he's a Jewish man. If he's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, he's probably a Jewish man. And the priest just looks at him and then passes by on the other side. And a lot of attention has been given to, why does he do that? Well, one of the things about a parable is you have to be careful not to stretch it too far. Jesus isn't saying this so that we can debate on why didn't he stop. That's not the point. The point is that the guy you would expect to stop didn't stop, right? Then you've got the second tier individual, the Levite. So likewise a Levite came by. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Levites were those individuals, part of the Levitical tribe, but not a part of the priesthood family, but they served the priesthood and served in the temple area. And so here are the two guys that you would think would stop and do something. And both of them look at him, and they go by on the other side and act like, really, it's not my problem. It's not my problem. Then in verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and he saw him and had compassion. Now, we'll look more in just a second about what the Samaritan does for him, but I want to think about this for a second. The fact that it's a Samaritan in the story, it's really hard to recreate that idea in the minds of people. So when I was going through this with a class, I asked them, I said, who do you think is one of the most hated men in America right now? You just tell me whoever you think. Well, the answer they gave me was Joe Biden, our president. I said, okay. I said, now let me retell this story to you. So there's a man on your street, on this dangerous street, who's been mugged and he's been left to die there. He's bleeding out. And since you chose politicians, I'm going to stick with politicians. Donald Trump and his escort roll by. They see him, and they keep going. Then former Vice President Pence rolls by, and they see him hurting and keep going. You say, they would never do that. You're missing the whole point. But President Biden stops and goes to him and takes off his jacket and puts it around his wound, puts him in his limousine, and takes him to a hospital. You see, that person that we got to be so careful with this political thing in Christianity. We got to be so careful. When we look at situations like that, we say that would never happen. That's exactly how the people listening to Jesus felt. That would never happen. There's no way a priest, there's no way a Levite doesn't help him. And there's no way a Samaritan helps a Jew. No way. Yes, it does. So, the Samaritan stops, and it says, when he went to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He was moved deeply on the inside. Now, what's interesting is that phrase is obviously very absent from the other men. They see him, but nothing is moved within them. They're not changed within. Their heart doesn't go out to a man who's dying on the side of the road. And so he went to him, and he bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. So when he sets him on his own animal, what does the Samaritan then have to do? He's walking. Okay? I mean, what he was riding, now he's walking. Then he takes him to an inn, and then he pays 2 denarii, which is 1 denarii is a denarius is a day's wage. And so he gives him a couple of days' wages. I don't know, just off the top of my head. He gives him $800-900. Okay? Then he tells him, whatever, I want you to take care of him because I've got to go and finish some things, but when I come back, we'll settle up and I'll pay you whatever I owe you. Now here's the thing. Innkeepers were notoriously bad people, crooks. And so, most likely when he came back, this innkeeper was going to hand him a bill that was far bigger than anything he actually did. And so, the Samaritan is willing to make a huge payment on his behalf to make sure that he's taken care of. It's actually way above and beyond what you would expect. So then with the story, Jesus comes to the point of it. And that's the thing about parables. They're driving at one point. So Jesus asked this question. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? You see, you want to get into a theological discussion about who is my neighbor. I want to tell you a story and ask you a question. Who acted like a neighbor to someone in need? You see, you're concerned about who is it that is my neighbor over here, and Jesus said, who was it that proved to be a neighbor? He shifts it away from who is my neighbor to will you be a neighbor to somebody? That's the way he turns it. And the Jewish teacher, his hatred of Samaritans probably is so deep, he won't even call him a Samaritan. He says, who do you think proved to be a neighbor to him? Well, the one who helped him. Don't miss that. What was he unwilling to say? Samaritan. And then Jesus said, now you go be like him. Boy, that rubbed all over him. The same way, If our parable where we put our politicians in, and Jesus said, and in this matter, go be like your president, because he showed compassion to a man. So the question of who is my neighbor, who is in my community, it's everybody. It's everybody. I have not seen any text in Scripture that would even hint at the idea that there is someone who is excluded from that circle. Whether it's in the answer that the lawyer gave here in Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself, which when you go back to Leviticus 19, that context deals with a host of different people. And then further, when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, what? At the very end of chapter 5, love your enemies. I mean, any way you want to come at this thing, Jesus doesn't qualify it. He puts everybody in that same circle and says, love them. Okay. So our neighbor is everybody. People say that's a big, long, large task to love everybody. That's right. But he's not just calling upon you to love everybody and not calling on you to know every single person on the planet to love them, but as you come into contact and as you interact with them, that's when you're called into action. So let's think about then what they need. And what I want to do, all I did in this particular section was go through Luke and look at the people that Jesus interacted with. Okay? That's all I did. Go through and look at the people he interacted with, and I tried to categorize them where you had multiple accounts. Okay? So, let's look at some of these. Number one, you've got someone, we'll call him uncontrollable. In Luke 4, you have demon-possessed individuals. Right? Now, obviously, demon possession is not something that continues today, and so it's going to be really hard to kind of make a proper comparison, but the closest thing I can give to you is a person who's uncontrollable. Because you remember the man that was possessed by Legion. In Mark's account, he would go out, and when they would try and bind him with chains, he would break them. When they would try and keep him in control, he would overpower them with his strength, and he lived out in the wilderness and in the mountains and in the hills crying out in the night. He was uncontrollable. So I want you to think about the person who is a criminal. And they don't care who they hurt. Or think about the kid at school who's out of control and nobody can reach him. And so everybody just kind of shuffles them along and pushes them down the line. Jesus stops and interacts with them and actually changes it. Think about people who have some kind of physical deformity, and there are a lot of these. The one under discussion here is the leper in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. Luke says that he is full of leprosy, which means he's got leprosy in its final stages, which would make him an extremely disfigured man. You can Google Hansen's disease and look at pictures of this. Some of you may have actually been to leper colonies if you've done mission work, because those colonies still exist. Okay? And so it wouldn't be unnatural to have an individual missing an ear or a nose or the front end of their nose or even their lips or their fingers. I mean, I can still see one picture in my head that I can't get rid of when I think about a leper. There's a man, and he's just deformed. But Jesus chose to interact with him and to touch him. Let me ask you something. What happens when we see a person out and they've got some kind of physical deformity? For years in a town, my hometown, there was a man, and I'd see him from time to time at Walmart, didn't know him, had no idea who he was, but I know he had this giant, what appeared to be a tumor on the back of his neck. Looked about kind of like the size of a volleyball, right back here. Or the kid who had tripped over a cord when his family was out having a fish fry, and all of the grease spilled over him. And so now his skin looked different. When we see somebody that's deformed, do we catch ourselves just staring at the individual? Listen, I understand that it can catch us off guard because it is a deformity. It's not that which is in line with what normally would be. But if that's as far as we ever go, we've got some major problems. We have this tendency to characterize people by what is wrong with them. For an example, one of the finest men I've ever known, Drew, actually gets his name from this man, Drew. He battled cancer for several years when I preached in Oxford, Alabama. And he was diagnosed not too long before we moved there. He was in his early 50s. And people would often ask, I'd go visit him and they'd find out I'd been there or something, and they'd say, well, how's he doing? What are the doctors saying? And my response to them was, I have no idea. And the reason why I didn't know was not because I didn't care. The problem is that when Drew got cancer, everybody started equating Drew with cancer. And the only thing they would ever talk to him about was whether he was dying or not. When I sat with him and I saw the way people were doing that, and it drove me crazy, when I sat with him, I made it my goal to only discuss the things that he enjoyed. We only talked about football, Alabama football. We only talked about those things because everybody began to treat him like he was a disease. Drew was still Drew. He had a disease. He wasn't the disease. Let him be a person. So you have physical deformities. What about the crooks? What about the tax collectors that Matthew, he called one to serve on his ministry team. Or Zacchaeus, one of the chief tax collectors in chapter 19. Well, you don't want to have anything to do. What's funny is that, so I'm always the new guy no matter where I go because of the nature of my job. When I move, I'm the new guy in town. Now, one of the things I like about that is this. I'm able to judge people based upon who they are right now, and I care nothing about what they did in their past because I don't know anything about it, and it doesn't affect me. And to be honest with you, I really just don't care because I've got a past too, and I'd prefer you not judge me on it either. But it's always interesting when people think they're doing you a favor, and they're like, oh, so you know this person, but do you know the real them? Mm-hmm. And if I can say this kindly, probably better than you do because I can see them for who they are now and not what they did 15 years ago. Jesus looked at these tax collectors, these crooks, and that's what they were. And he saw them still as people. Then further, you had the foreigner, the Gentile, the centurion, the Roman soldier who served in the Roman army for 20 years, the oppressor of the Jewish nation. He comes and he has a servant who is sick, and he sends a delegation to Jesus to get his help, and Jesus helps him. How do we feel when we go to certain places and there are people who are foreign? They're not Americans. They're of different nationalities. And one of the things you quickly learn as an American is our idea of a social bubble that you don't violate doesn't exist in most parts of the world. It does not exist. We were at the splash pad in Carterville the other day, and I was sitting in a chair, and I turned around, and there was a lady who was sitting there, and I was almost basically sitting in her lap. And I told Brooke, I said, you could have at least told me I was almost sitting in the woman's lap. But she was so incredibly close, but she thought nothing of it because the country of her descent, that is not something that is known. You don't get the privilege of having your space because you're jammed together. Or what about when they do things and they have different smells for the cuisine that they cook? So here's Jesus still interacting. Miss Debbie, I think I've jammed it up. Okay. So then we have the widow in Luke chapter 7, the widow at Nain. Her son has died, and Jesus raises him from the dead. Okay? We're just moving. And what I hope you're seeing is there's a great diversity of people that Jesus has already interacted with on the front end. All right? Luke 7, the sinful woman comes in and eats at the Pharisee. When Jesus is eating at a Pharisee's house, I like this story because it has two things that merge. So first you have the sinful woman. And people throughout the years have all said, well, you know, she's a sinful woman. You know what that means, wink, wink. Actually, no, we don't know what that means. The Bible just says she's a sinful woman. It does not say what her sin is. And here she is interacting with Jesus. And Jesus is not repulsed by the fact that she kisses his feet. The fact that a woman touches a man is really a no-no in this culture anyway, other than a relative. And then he interacts with the Pharisee at this place, and it's not the only time in Luke where he interacts with Pharisees. You know, a lot of times people view the Pharisees as Jesus' kind of arch enemy, right? Like it was him against them. But when you read Luke, you find that Jesus actually extended olive branches to them. He would go and eat when they're home with them. He would go to their banqueting feasts. So you had a notoriously sinful woman and then a religious man, and Jesus is interacting with them both. And I got to be honest with you. Of all these lists, and we're going to just speed through a few more here in just a minute, of all the people on this list, the group of people that I struggle with the most are religious people. Self-righteous religious people, as the Pharisees were. I struggle with them. When people are legalistic and domineering in the way they treat people, that just flies all over me. And when I see people that I know are of this slant, a lot of the times what I want to do is basically just duck and hide. Or just go on and not even really interact with them. But you know, the thing in studying Luke recently, and in studying for this, that I have been shown is this: that attitude isn't right. Because Jesus would still interact with people with whom he vehemently disagreed and who were mistreating the people of God. He would still interact with them and still try to reach them. So you've got sinners and religious people. Jesus is interacting with them. You got those who are dying. This is the woman with the issue of blood in Luke chapter 8. So She has spent all of her money on physicians, and she's not getting any better. She's actually getting worse. Jesus is interacting with her. And by the way, you'll notice that some of these you would expect. Some of these groups you're comfortable, and I'm comfortable with interacting with, right? But there are other people that we might be uncomfortable interacting with. That's the point. Okay? So then you had those who were needy, those who were poor, like Lazarus. Each culture has its own issues, okay? And one of the issues that the American culture has, the American church has to pay attention to, is its cultural influence in believing that in America, if you work hard, you'll succeed. I'm going to tell you something right now. That's not true. Working hard and success don't equal each other. Our founders didn't believe that. They believed that working hard, you should have equal opportunity to succeed. But there was no guarantee that you would. And so we look at poor people and we say, well, you know, if he'd managed his money better, he wouldn't be poor. If he'd get up and go to work, he wouldn't be poor. We need to be careful of that attitude and to really read Luke carefully, because Jesus abhors that type of thinking. He abhors it. Here were needy people. Jesus fed them. And people say, well, you know, you look at this crowd in Luke chapter 9, and people would say, well, you know, they're following Jesus. They should have thought beforehand and packed their lunch so he wouldn't have to feed them. They're just following him for a meal ticket, right? Well, you know what happened in John chapter 6? There were people that were following him because he was a meal ticket. And you know what he did? He fed them. He fed them. And then he confronted them. But he fed them. Then, as we push forward, Miss Debbie, I'm jamming this thing up, and I'm not really sure why I'm doing it. But okay. Then you have the individuals who are prejudiced. Luke 9, the Samaritans refused to let Jesus come through and stay in their town because, you know, he's going to Jerusalem, so, you know, we're not going to let him through. How do you deal with prejudiced people? Do you interact with people? Racism, to me, is an absolutely asinine notion. I don't understand it. It makes zero sense to me. But I still have a responsibility to try and help people. Even if they believe something that I think is not only just not well-founded, but even flat out unbiblical. Then as we walk through a few more of these, you've got individuals who are handicapped. You have a blind man who is begging. Jesus helps them. And actually, in some of these accounts, when Jesus is dealing with these people who have handicaps and they're calling out for Jesus to help them, the disciples are saying, shh, be quiet, leave him alone, he's too busy. And Jesus chooses to stop and help them. Then you've got children. And people will say, well, of course, well, I mean, why wouldn't you help children? Well, let me explain to you. You would think that taking an interest in a child is a universal phenomenon, but I'm here to tell you it's not. In a previous job I had, I was constantly raked over the coals by the leaders of that church because the members complained that I spent too much time playing with kids. I had the same response you did. What do you say to that? But there are people who believe it. Then you've got, me and this clicker are just not being friends tonight. Miss Debbie's going to rescue us here. You have individuals who are rich. That's the rich young ruler. Then the next individuals that we have are his disciples. And you know, the disciples made plenty of mistakes. They were, as Jesus was going to the cross, they were arguing about who's going to get the best position in the kingdom. That is like a person literally dying on their bed and their kids are talking about them like they're not there, about who's going to get what. So what have we seen? Look, we've seen Jew, Gentile, Samaritan, rich, poor, religious, sinner, children, adults, handicapped, healthy people, all across the spectrum. All of their needs are different, but none of them are excluded and none of them are unimportant. And every one of them are our neighbors. And there are some of them that we're going to be more comfortable interacting with and helping with. But that does not excuse us from not interacting with and helping people of which we may not be comfortable. So, how do we help them? To me, it's really this simple. Number one, see them. Reject any notion that someone tries to put people in their nice, neat little boxes. And where we can tag them instead of seeing them. Let me see if I can illustrate this. So, all people who are homeless must be moochers. That's the way it's tagged by a lot of people. All right, let me give you an equivalent statement, because I don't believe that that statement is very fair, but I'll give you an equivalent one. All Christians are hypocrites. We say, no. Okay, well, let me ask you then, why is it you think all homeless people are moochers? Well, you know, I saw one and I read a story one time and this happened to me one time. You're really going to characterize an entire population based upon the interaction of three people? Because I got to be honest with you, I don't want anybody characterizing the church of the Lord based upon interactions with just three people. Especially when those interactions were less than favorable. What if you went and sat down? As I said, my friend directs this ministry in Little Rock. What if you sat down with them and talked to them and they started to explain to you that they grew up in an abusive home? They had a learning disability long before they really, really understood anything about them. And even though they were placed in the special education department at the school, what they did to them all day was actually roll in a TV, press in a video cassette, and hit play until the period was over, and then they sent them to the next teacher, and that's what they did until they dropped out of school in the 8th grade. Some people have never known some of the opportunities that you and I have taken for granted. What if we just started seeing people? For who they are. And if we just for a moment would climb down from our high horse and say, you know what, if I'm in that situation, it might not have turned out so well for me either. I don't know about you, but I can look back on my life and I can see a couple of decisions where my life goes in a completely different direction if something happens. I know it. See them. Look at the pictures here. This lady, I think, in one of the pictures has a nose ring. This person is artistic. You know, those crazy liberal people, which, by the way, my wife is one of those. She has an art degree. You got an individual who is foreign. Now, when I said that about her, it made sense, right? You laughed at it. But how many times do we do that to other people? Did you know a gay person is still a person? That a transgendered person is still a person? See them. Not what's in front of them, not what they are emitting. See them for who they are. Number 2, engage them. Talk with them. I am amazed at the amount of people who, when you deal with, especially for some reason, when you deal with LGBTQ plus or, that acronym changes from time to time. I'm not saying that mockingly. It does change from time to time. But the amount of people who, it's like, if you sit next to them, you're going to like catch it or something. That's still a person. I have family that's in that community. I have family in that community. And one of the things you might find if you sat and talked with someone is that they're a normal human being with hopes and dreams and aspirations and feelings. Listen, no one is saying that we're going to accept sinful behavior. Nobody's saying that. But us mistreating them and sending them away is about like people in the hospital coming at the door and the nurse is like, nope, I think you got something. You need to go get better and then you can come back and see us at the ER. The ER is where I need to be. I'm dying. The church is where people need to be. They're dying. And if we won't help them, who will? Who will? What if one day it's one of my sons who struggles with that? What if it's one of my grandkids who struggles with that? I wouldn't agree with it, but I would certainly hope that people would still see them as people and draw them with the sweetness and the gentleness of Christ. Number 3, love them. Love them. Feel for them. They're human beings. They experience hurt like you do. Many of them carry great, great baggage of hurt. And finally, help them. Wherever they may be, help them. There have been a handful of books. Obviously, the Bible is the one that's made all of the difference in the world in my life and my understanding of certain things, however limited and insufficient that understanding is. But one of the books that has made a strong impression on my mind was about Jesus. And the man is a world reporter. And so his experience, a lot of people's experience when they try and analyze subjects, their experience is limited to a very small understanding. When you get out and you travel and you see the world, you understand there's something much bigger out here. The world is not like it is in my house. The world is much bigger than that. I'll never forget in this book, the writer said, because his wife was the director of a women's ministry in a major city that dealt with women who were caught in harlotry. We'll use a biblical word, it's a little veiled there. And she said to her, one of the young ladies she was meeting with one time, she said, "Have you ever thought about going to church?" Her response was this: "Why would I ever go there?" And then he asked this question: "Don't you think it's a problem when people who felt comfortable around Jesus feel uncomfortable around his people?" People say, "No, harlots didn't feel comfortable around Jesus." Oh, yeah, they did. Jesus never once compromised the gospel. He never would. But why in Luke chapter 15, you know that great parable that everybody loves, the prodigal son? You remember what caused it? Tax collectors and sinners who were drawing near to Jesus, and he was eating with them. Is there something wrong when the people who were drawn to Jesus are repulsed by his people? I have wrestled with that question for years. And I don't know how to change it. So when we talk about serving our community, look, this is not about investing millions of dollars and doing some giant thing. If we will just simply start seeing people and engaging people and loving people and helping people, period, with no qualifications, just loving them, seeing them, helping them, that's serving our community. It's serving them. So, in the words of Jesus, he said to him, "You go and do likewise." And I think that's exactly what he's saying to us. Love people the way that I did. Tonight, his invitation is open to us all. Who've never become a Christian with a penitent faith that confesses Christ, to be baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins, be a New Testament Christian. Maybe as a New Testament Christian, I haven't been who I need to be. I want to pray about that publicly, that's great. Privately, that's great. Maybe I'm just struggling with life. Whatever it is, I don't know about you, but I'm thankful that Jesus doesn't repulse us. He isn't repulsed by us. That even in our hurt, he draws us into himself. And that's what he wants us to do for others. And now is an opportunity that if we need that, he will do that for us now. If we can help you, let us know. We stand and sing this song.